Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video in which I'm going to talk about the one book I've completed this week, Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. It's a big book, 560 pages, and obviously David Mitchell is an author of big status, having written books like Cloud Atlas, The Thousand Sons of Jacob de Zoet, Black Swan Green. I've read everything by David Mitchell, which is why I sort of picked this up despite hating his previous book, the absolutely execrable Bone Clocks, more of which later. So Utopia Avenue is about a British band, from the imaginary British band from the 1967-68 period, and their rise to sort of fame and stardom. It's a four-piece sort of put together by a sort of Svengali or a music guru called Levan Franklin, and the four members are Elizabeth Francis, known as Elf for short, Holloway, who has a background in folk music and is a multi-instrumentalist and plays piano and keyboards in this. We have Dean Moss, a working class hero who is the bassist. We have Jasper de Zoet, yes, a relative from the previously aforementioned book. And we have Griff Griffin, who's the drummer. And the way the book is structured is that Griff Griffin doesn't write songs. Each of the other three brings songwriting to the band and are credited solo with the song that they bring to the band. And the book is divided into sections according to the three albums that the band released, so that the first section will be side one of the first album with songs listed, and because each of them has a solo music writing credit, that character tends to be the focus of that chapter. And that's done throughout the whole book. The book doesn't start off very well in that it starts with Dean, and it's written in such ways to make you think that, you know, something good is going to happen, and unfortunately I immediately, before the reveal, realised that something bad was happening. And there's another stage in the book where I was ahead, where there was another major event affecting one of the members of the band, and again I was ahead of the game. So that was a problem, that this book is entirely predictable. You know, if you sat down and drew everything that you knew about sort of music and bands from the 60s and wrote it out, you'd pretty much get this, because it doesn't lift from the page. There's nothing startling or new, there's no new information, although we get lots of cameos from the likes of David Bowie, Joni Mitchell, Janis Joplin, Leonard Cohen, the Grateful Dead. They're cameos, so you don't really get any sense of who these people are, or at least in terms of how Mitchell is portraying these people. You know, they're only there to sort of tide mark the rise in status of the band Utopia Avenue. The only exception to that is, I would say, the artist Francis Bacon. He does come over as actually a slightly more rounded character in this. But, you know, for a book about sex, drugs and rock and roll, the writing is unable to lift it off the page. And this is what I mean. You know, this will not give you anything that you would imagine for yourself about that whole period in sort of music, as it moved from sort of into the modern age, really, pre-hip-hop, of rock and roll, where pop sort of turned more to rock. And it's really, really disappointing. So, you know, when it's not sex, drugs and rock and roll, you get the sort of personal lives of the three characters. Griff Griffin, because he's not a songwriter, doesn't really sort of get sections to himself. So it's really the three characters, Elf, Jasper and Dean. And, you know, it takes 150 pages before they get the first single out. So there's an awful lot of flashback. We get an awful lot of flashbacks to their childhood in a very, again, uninvolving way, really. So Dean, the working class hero, the working class boy made good, who leaves his, you know, working class community, not quite a ghetto, but, you know, not far short. And, you know, he's Jack about town, Jack the lad, you know, sex and drugs more than any of the other members of the band. But, you know, he reaches a point where he is facing 5 dilemmas in his life that he lists out. You know, a relationship with his alcoholic, abusive father, which he sort of, you know, cut himself off from, and his father suddenly turns up again. Has he fathered an illegitimate child with a woman he has no desire to, you know, to make it long term? his sort of childhood friend from back home, who's a sort of successful drug dealer and pimp, that there's some sort of Byzantine storyline involving him. But the point is, I didn't care. I did not care about the outcome of any of these dilemmas. He is a thoroughly unlikable character, and if bad things end up happening to him, you just think, well, you know, you brought it on yourself, mate. The next character is Elf Holloway. In 1966, 67, 68, it was still unusual for a woman to be in a band of rockers, unless she was the lead singer, like in Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick. But because she's an instrumentalist, so every interview they have asks her what it's like to be in a male band. And the business side of it, she gets treated, you know, like she's ignored, and, you know, they always defer to the men for the answers, for the decisions, all this sort of stuff, which is fine and perfectly legitimate. But that's it. That, you know, the issue is raised, but it's not really delved into. There's nothing feminist. There's no feminist critique or analysis of it. It's just sort of churned over and over and over again that this is what she faces. The situation never moves on. So again, I don't see what it really brings to the party there. There's also a story where in her family there's an infant cot death, which should absolutely punch you to the guts, and, you know, all your breath should leave you. And the way it's written here, it doesn't. It's you know, one of the things I remember about that section is the two fathers, or grandfathers of the dead child, are sort of saying, you know, there are no words for this, or, you know, keep your chin up, and they're sort of recognising their own inability to emotionally cope with the situation. But that's sort of the focus of it, rather than something that makes you the reader. You know, the bereaved mother, who's Elf's sister, spends a lot of time sleeping it off in bed under the influence of drugs, which I'm sure would be a thing, but it means we don't get at the sort of, you know, the sort of cutting edge, you know, rawness of it, because she's out, you know, zonked out on sedatives. So Elf was I felt a very underdeveloped character, really. She was the most interesting, well, no, she wasn't the most interesting, but she was more interesting than Dean, but Dean is much more the focus of this book, unfortunately. And then we come to Jasper de Zoet, who is potentially the most interesting one. He has an internal voice, it might be schizophrenic, we don't know initially, who he calls Knock Knock. And a lot of the flashback is about him at school and in an asylum, being treated for this and stuff, which is quite interesting. And as a reader, you're trying to tune into, well, is this schizophrenia or some other mental condition? And the fact that it refers back to the Thousand Sons of Jacob de Zoet is fine, you know, that works, a bit of the sort of family history going back a century into that. But then, unfortunately, as his story wears on, David Mitchell refers to another of his books, which is The Bone Clocks, and we get this thing of unembodied people, or spirits, or possession, or ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, directly taken, you know, the characters are taken from Bone Clocks. So now we have this thing of Jasper is basically possessed by a character from Jacob de Zoet, who wasn't like that in Jacob de Zoet, but because of the framework of this sort of disembodied spirit thing in Bone Clocks, Mitchell has reached back to take a character from Jacob de Zoet and put it through the filter of Bone Clocks, which is a pity, because I love A Thousand Sons of Jacob de Zoet. I think it's beautiful, filigree writing, none of which is in here, by the way. And it's been spoiled, because now it's been refracted through the nonsense that is the Bone Clocks and all this stuff about disembodied spirit possession. And I hate David Mitchell for doing that, for taking away a book of his that I love by mangling it with an update it didn't need, or a reboot that it didn't need in the form of this book. And also, this book is entirely, you know, sort of realism, I suppose with a bit of fantasy thrown in the sense of aspiration, although you're aspiring to something that happened 60 years ago in the 1960s. And then the Jasper de Zoet thing is in another genre entirely, which is sort of supernatural fantasy. You know, it doesn't sit well in this book. And it's, that whole, I hated bone clocks. I hate that same world as appears here in Jasper de Zoet's character. It's just, this book, I hated. I absolutely hated this book. It fell flat. The writing doesn't rise off the page. It told me nothing. It didn't bring that world of excess and, art. It just didn't come alive. And then you get this Jasper de Zoet nonsense. So just to finish up, I'm going to read some very, very short sections to give you an idea of what I don't like about it. So Elf has been reunited with her partner, girlfriend. You're that princess, says Louisa, the one in the tower, Rapunzel. A New York Rapunzel's hair wouldn't reach the pavements. A New York Rapunzel would have a specially made wig. Louisa coils Elf's hair around her thumb and whispers in her ear, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, deja caer tu cabello. So that's a really kind of crappy piece of writing. A New York Rapunzel would have a specially made wig because of skyscrapers. I mean, that's just doesn't work. Okay, so this is an example of the bone clock's dread influence. The Nemo parallax shows autumn at Richtschop giving way to summer. Fallen leaves fly up to twigs, attach themselves and blush from brown to red to orange and green. Everything's happening backwards. You're re-experiencing your memories in reverse. We're rewinding. Why is everything sharper than my usual memories? Dr. Baroness extends the analogy. The Menino parallax is a master tape, full, four-dimensional, multi-sensory, stereo surround technicolor. Regular memories are courtroom sketches, elaborated and eroded at every viewing. So, comparing, sort of full, digital complexity vision with courtroom sketches is a nice image in isolation. But when it's taken in the context of this, trying to sort of, this, what he calls Nemo parallax, it's nonsense. It's, why is everything sharper than my usual memories? It just doesn't work. Regular memories are courtroom sketches, elaborated and eroded at every viewing. Now that notion of eroded at every viewing is a really interesting one for how memory works. But it's never picked up again. This is nonsense theory dropped in the book, referring to the world of a previous novel of his. So it can't therefore have serious analytical consideration of this notion of, in real life, our memories do sort of get less and less sharp as we replay them. And finally, early in the book, this is a meditation on art. The Kinks song Waterloo Sunset comes on the radio. Elf looks out at Denmark Street. Hundreds of people pass by. Reality erases itself as it re-records itself, Elf thinks. Time is the great forgetter. She gets her notebook from her handbag and writes, memories are unreliable. Art is memory made public. Time wins in the long run. Books turn to dust, negatives decay, records get worn out, civilizations burn. But as long as the art endures, a song or a view or a thought or a feeling someone once thought worth keeping is saved and stays shareable. Others can say, I feel that too. Now, superficially that sounds profound, but actually it isn't at all. Reality erases itself as it re-records itself, Elf thinks. Sounds profound, but actually isn't. Time is the great forgetter. She gets her notebook from her handbag and writes, memories are unreliable. Duh. Art is memory made public. Well, yeah, whatever. Time wins out in the long run. Yeah. And, the songs of the band are reproduced in here. And the lyrics are all directly drawn from the situations you already read about for these characters, which makes them completely unimaginative. And again, the songs do not soar off the page because you kind of read them all in prose. And now, they managed to make it slightly lyrical, but you know what they're referring to. It just doesn't work on any level, this book. And David Mitchell, I'm done with him. I'm done with him for two reasons. I'm done with him because he cannot help himself bringing this side of his writing that he's absolutely obsessed with, which is this sort of supernatural. It was in Cloud Atlas where it just about worked. It was in Bone Clocks where it absolutely didn't, and now he's brought it into here, which clangs against the tone of the rest of the book. And also the writing here. There's Mitchell is good, or was good, for some insight, for some interesting images and juxtapositions. If his early books like Ghost Written and things like that, none of that is evidenced here at all. You don't lose that skill, but it's enthralled to this greater thing that he wants to do with, this whole Bone Clocks. I suspect everything from here on from him will be in the world of Bone Clocks, that sort of spirit, disembodied world. And the other thing is, with Jasper de Zoet in here, it starts off when it's just realism, even if he's having these sort of mental, imargos and things like that. It is basically realism, and you think, well, this is going to be interesting. This is treatment of a mental illness and how he copes with it and overcomes it, or at least abides with it so he can become a guitarist and go on tour and do all these sorts of things. But once the Bone Clock stuff world is introduced, it's actually quite poor taste and dangerous, I think, because it's dismissing, all the doctors, because they don't have access to this sort of Bone Clocks world. Well, the doctors and psychiatrists assume it's some sort of mental disorder, as they would. And now no longer is it that, and they're dismissed. They're put down for thinking, for having that limited range of knowledge and understanding, because they're not aware of this, supernatural world. So, it's dismissed out of hand as valueless, which I think is a very dangerous message. If you write a whole book in the fantasy genre, such as Bone Clocks, that's fine, because you've set up the whole world. Here, in a book which is basically realism of life on the road, of the business of rock and roll, etc., etc., then to sort of say that someone who is struggling within that world is not having a mental issue but is possessed, and a mental sort of psychiatric diagnosis is valueless, I think it's really dangerous to play with that notion. And I was actually I was annoyed by that. I was really annoyed. So 2 stars. Anyway, on to hopefully books of happier cheer. I took delivery of most of these this week. The first is Nothing by Blake Butler, which is non-fiction. He's an insomniac, as am I, and I've read quite a few books about insomnia. None of them really quite get there. The closest was this, Samantha Harvey, with The Shapeless Unease, which I read this year, which is a brilliant book, but it's not particularly enlightening on insomnia, except in a couple of places, but it's quite interesting on the relationship of her insomnia to her creative process. So, this was definitely a worthwhile read, but it didn't really nail anything about insomnia. So I'm hoping this does. So I'm looking forward to that. I ought to say, just having read Blake Butler's novel Alice Knott last week, that does to art what this failed to do, because that bit I read from Alf, the last bit I read about sort of art is timeless. What was interesting about Alice Knott is that Butler is posing the notion that what if art isn't timeless? What if it has mortality, just as the human beings who created it and who are portrayed in it are in fact mortal? That's by the by. Yi Young Lee's new novel, Must I Go? Which I will probably, this will be my next read, I suspect. I don't know much about it. Leela Lisker is 81. She has shrewdly outlived 3 husbands, raised 5 children and seen the birth of 17 grandchildren. Now she has turned her keen attention to a strange little book published by a vanity press, the diary of a long-forgotten man named Roland Booley, with whom she once had a fleeting affair, etc. So that sounds pretty good. The last in Ali Smith's quartet, Summer, which I shall be reading. I'm not sure what my enthusiasm for this is. Of the 3 I've read so far, I did enjoy Spring the most, which leads me, before this arrived, to have hope that that it was a continuous upward curve for the quartet. But hearing Eric talk about it, she ties together a lot of the loose leads from the other 3, which always fills me with dread, because sometimes that can be sort of overworked or just connections made that just invite too great a leap of faith. But anyway, I could be doing a disservice, so I should be reading that. Robert Perisic, No Signal Area, arrived this week, although I don't think I'm going to get to it till next year, because I'm not a big one for reading an author more than once a year. I read Our Man in Iraq, which is his debut novel, or at least debut translated into English novel. Really enjoyed it. Bought this straight away on the back of it, but I don't think I'm going to get to it till next year, although it will be early next year. Translated by Ellen Elias Bursac. I saw yesterday that Camille, from What Camille Reads, reviewed this. He was pretty positive about it. He hasn't read Our Man in Iraq. But anyway, so I am looking forward to it, but it will be next year. An Adultery by Alexander Theroux. Okay, so I've talked about Alexander Theroux quite a lot. One of his biggest fans is Leaf by Leaf on his BookTube channel. Again, I read Theroux's book Three Wogs this year, so I probably won't get to this till next year, but he's an extraordinary writer. And talking of Leaf by Leaf, he's a huge William T. Volman fan. I've never read William T. Volman, so I asked Leaf by Leaf, Chris, what to start with. He gave me 2 or 3. They're not all readily available, but this one I got from Thrift Books in America. It's quite a chunker, as you can see, so I don't know when I'm going to get to this. 650 pages, something. Oh no, more than that, 750 pages. Having just read a couple of big books, I need to read some shorter books, so I don't think I'm going to get to this year. Nor this, Dennis Johnson, Tree of Smoke, a novel. Having said that, I don't read an author, or I tend not to read an author more than once in a year. I have read 2 Dennis Johnson books this year, The Resuscitation of a Hanged Man and Angels, and I've declared that I'm going to read all of Dennis Johnson's novels. So I took the advantage of getting this. And again, it's another chunker. It's like 600 pages. So the combination of having read 2 of his books this year, plus the size of it, I won't get to it till next year. So as I say, of the books that have arrived this week, this will be my next fiction read, definitely. And I'm really keen to get to Blake Butler's book on insomnia and see what it can deliver. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks very much. Till next time.